Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all here tonight, and I think you'll be in for a treat, a great conversation about the work of principals. My name's Pam Bishop, and I'm the Associate Dean of Graduate Programs in the Faculty of Education here at Western University. Tonight we're going to hear about a conversation related to supporting the contemporary work of principals. We have three fine scholars here. Dr. Katina Pollock, who is, as many of you know, a fine member of the Faculty of Education here at Western, Dr. Sue Winton from York University, and Dr. Elizabeth Murakami from the University of Texas at San Antonio. Tonight we will hear them talk, and they will discuss many aspects of the work of principals, and at the end of their conversation we'll invite you to ask questions or make comments about the conversation you've heard. Dr. Katina Pollock is an assistant professor in this faculty, as I said, and her research interests include teacher and school administrator work practices. Dr. Sue Winton is an assistant professor at York University in Toronto, and her main interests in research are implications of education policy and processes for critical democracy. Dr. Elizabeth Murakami is a visiting scholar here in the Faculty of Education. She is an associate professor in educational leadership and policy studies at the University of Texas, as I mentioned. Her research focuses on successful school leadership and social justice for urban and international education. She has an earned doctorate from Michigan State University and has worked in American international schools for 14 years. She teaches graduate level courses in school leadership, applied research, and organisational theory and change. Our first discussant tonight will be Dr. Katina Pollock.
Thank you, Pam. So I'm going to spend about 7 to 10 minutes talking about a research project that's in progress right now. The project is called Principals' Work in Contemporary Times. It is a research project that's in collaboration with 7 school districts in southwestern Ontario. We are in the middle of it's a multi-stage or multi-phase research project, and the first phase includes interviewing principals. And what we've hoped to do is interview approximately 12 to 16 principals in each board. Our minimum is to try to get 10 from each board. Currently we have, out of the 7 boards, 3 boards we've met our minimum limit, so yahoo, that's good. So we have 35, I think it's 35 interviews completed. We're hoping to get to 60 or 70, and we actually have 11 more organized for the next 2 weeks. So we're pretty happy with that, considering the political climate in the education sector right now. So this research focuses on exploring how principals approach their work, how they spend their time, the motives and external factors that influence their choices and their decision making. We're hoping to look at the challenges and possibilities that their work presents. I'm not going to give you any specific, these are preliminary findings I'm going to talk about today. So we have not read all of the interviews. They're not all transcribed yet. It's a little labor intensive, and so we're in different positions with different interviews. But there are 3 general things that I'd like to draw your attention to. And these are pretty big, what I would call meta themes that we're seeing in the data. And it centers around tensions. And the first is tension between managing and leading instruction. And when we started the pilot project, and I should say, I'm saying we because I have a team of researchers that work with me, and a number of them are in the room, and I'd like to point them out actually. So over here to my left, your right, is Michael, and then we have Esma, and in the middle we have Patricia. So, and some of you may actually be people that we have interviewed, but we wouldn't want to point you out because it's supposed to be anonymous. Anyway, so back to the 3 points. So, tension between managing and leading instruction. What I realized in our pilot project after 4 or 5 interviews was that I had made an assumption that we all understood what instructional leadership meant. And what I realized very soon in the interviewing was that people had different notions of what instructional leadership actually meant. So we started asking people that we interviewed what they meant by instructional leadership. And it ranged from providing supports to teachers in a school site where it was release time, or supporting them so that they could go to professional learning that was outside of the school, bringing speakers in, to actually modeling practices in the classroom. So there was quite a range around what they meant by leading instruction. But what I want to point out in the tension was that the managerial component seemed to be taking over the instructional component of administrators' work. And I mean, I can't give you a percentage. We won't know those kinds of percentages until we actually do some on-site observations, which is our phase 2 actually of the study, where we're going to do observations and follow a number of principles around. So the managerial component seems to be increasing in response to multiple accountability systems that are on the horizon and have been initiated in the last 10 years. The second tension is tension between participatory decision-making and organizational directives. And what I mean by that, it's really essentially principals' power. And that's power collectively at the school site, but also power vertically through the board up to the ministry. So in some instances, it's let's engage parents in decision-making, and on the other hand, there are other directives where principals are they're they bear the sole responsibility for particular decisions and expectations, and it's a directive. And there are tensions that are drawn, that are competing there around running schools and how principals enact their power and authority. The third tension is around driving initiatives and change. And what I mean by that is activities in the actual schooling in schools, in the sense, these three tensions are not necessarily discrete. They obviously overlap. But the third tension is about bringing stakeholders to the table in initiatives that unfold at the school site. So that would be including parents, bringing teachers on board, now early childhood educators. It's thinking about those multiple contracts that have to be honored and trying to get people to come together to work collaboratively for student success, student achievement, however you want to define it. And I'd like to also point out, in general terms, taking these 3 points on face value, some of you might say, well, that's not necessarily anything new, but what I would argue is the rate with which it's happening has definitely increased. The intensity is way more intense, and the space with which decisions are made, initiatives are implemented, are much more complex than they may have been previously. And so it's how these things are unfolding is what's changing. And so what does this have to do for, implications for supporting administrators now and in the future, aspiring administrators, experienced administrators? I think it's thinking about, I would argue, it's about relationships, but what is it about relationships? Is it how to build relationships, how to negotiate, working together, those kinds of things. And I'm going to leave it there because that's my 10 minutes. And I'm going to pass it over to Sue now, who's actually going to talk about specific kinds of relationships and principals' power.
Thanks, Katina. So I think Katina's done a pretty good job setting us up and reminding us that principals today navigate a really complex environment. So I'm going to spend my time drawing on the research literature to argue based 3 points. First is that the principal's role is an inherently political one. And that second, principals need political skills and knowledge to achieve a variety of goals, both their own and their school communities, also the districts, the Ministry of Education, and of course, oftentimes they conflict or the demands on time conflict. So they need to know how to manage these tricky political situations. And so I want to argue also that principal preparation and professional learning should address and enhance principals' political roles. So first one, I want to say that schools are highly political organizations, and they're political in two ways. One way, some people might think of it as like a little p politics, and that's just in the way that people interact with one another and try to get each other to do kind of what they want to be done, so just influencing one another. But also, schools are political in another way, and that is that the choices that people make in schools have consequences for challenging or reproducing the status quo. And so furthermore, how principals act politically, we know from research, actually impacts the teaching and learning that go on in the school, the success or lack thereof of reform efforts. It affects school governance and relationships, and as I mentioned, whether inequities in school and beyond are challenged or recreated. So some of the skills that have, in particular, although I won't be able to discuss all of them, that principals really need to be able to possess. First, though, they need to have a good understanding of the political environment in which they work. So this involves identifying the main actors of influence, identifying what are those sort of informal communication processes. They need to understand the possibilities for mobilizing other people. They need to be able to anticipate the pushback that they might get when they want to propose something, and then so that way they can then have some prepared counter strategies. Then they need to be able, some of the ways that they might acquire this knowledge comes through just interacting with lots of different kinds of people, sitting on board-wide committees, moving from board to board, using different focus groups, and listening to other people. Because one of the things they really need to do then is once they have this knowledge, then they use it to then determine which political strategies to use, when, and with whom. And so some of those other skills, of course, we often hear about how principals need to establish a vision. But of course, it's not just their vision. Hopefully they will work with others to establish that vision. But furthermore, they have to encourage people to go along with it and to help realize it. And this often involves being able to persuade people. And as I said, having a good knowledge and understanding of the different people, the different players, the different actors will help with the persuasion process. So some of the ways that principals do persuade is that they use language strategically. They choose their words carefully. They may use complimenting superiors. They might take the language of particular policies and use it in particular ways. They circulate information. They ask important questions. And then part of the persuading process, of course, can be to bargain and to negotiate. And again, that's where they really draw on their knowledge of the environment. What are the kinds of things that might be of interest or and useful in bargaining and negotiating with different groups? Principals also need to be able to build alliances. They've always got to be on the lookout to think about how they might be able to establish their credibility. I mean, looking out for allies that they might be able to work with on particular issues. And I also want to talk also about policy appropriation as a particular skill. Policy appropriation is how a principal makes sense of the district and provincial policy mandates and trying to figure out how is it going to be enacted at the school level. Now, this process is inevitable, of course. Sometimes we just call it implementation, but it can be more or less strategic. Principals can really make thoughtful and strategic decisions about the kind of language that they use. They can be, when they think about who to involve or not to involve in decision making, and they can look for opportunities that exist within mandates or within policies where they might be able to use that opportunity to create a new opportunity, perhaps not intended by the policy, but a door that opened as well as a window as well. part of the argument for thinking about principals as policy actors rather than implementers or technicians is that it recognizes the agency and the active role that principals can take in working with policy and seeing themselves as legitimate policy actors. And as I mentioned when I started talking, that the political approach of the school administrator is actually the most important determinant of the micropolitical culture in the school. So that is that how the principal acts influences the way other individuals and groups interact within the school and how they use their own power, formal and informal, to achieve their goals. So for example, if teachers perceive that a principal is unsupportive, teachers will then be more likely to be defensive and cautious when working with parents. They may displace their frustration and hostility on students. On the other hand, if teachers perceive their principal to be supportive, the teacher's interactions with parents are more likely to be rational, honest, and productive. And some researchers have concluded that school micropolitics actually constitute the central mechanism through which all organizational outcomes are determined. And furthermore, if that's not enough, research also suggests when superintendents ask, what are some of the top reasons that principals lose their jobs? Some of the most common reasons are directly linked to principals' inabilities to operate effectively in the political environment. So these things include not the inability to build positive relationships, to manage the diverse political demands, and to build a strong base of support. So what and I'm not the first to claim it, that argues that principal preparation should acknowledge explicitly the political roles that principals play in schools and then help to prepare them for that political role. And furthermore, for those people who are currently practicing as part of their professional learning, principals' professional learning can also involve enhancing principals' own political skills as a means to hope to achieve their goals in their schools and communities and society. Thanks. Betty, over to you.
So today we're talking about different things and the different angles about principals. And Katina started talking about some of the work challenges today. There has been a change in the way principals work. There has been a change in pace. Sue was talking about some skills that were never considered before in leadership, right? Like being politically savvy, knowing how to turn that knowledge into agency. And all these things are fascinating when we think about how to prepare principals today. As an instructor, as a professor researching on principals, I always have to try to translate that into something that my students can apply. So visiting from Texas and looking at the Ontario Leadership Framework, I'm very impressed that not only knowledge and skills are important for principals, but their personal resources, something that the Texas standards and expectations for principals do not include, even though the Ontario Leadership Framework has a lot of similar characteristics and expectations for principals. So the 2012 Ontario Leadership Framework includes these three areas in the personal resources. The cognitive area that talks about the knowledge and the problem solving that the principals need to do, the knowledge that they have to apply, right, to have the classrooms going, and the social skills, perceive and manage emotions in oneself and in the others, and act in emotionally appropriate ways. This is kind of interesting, right? Knowing that every day there's something going on in schools with emotions. And then psychological resources. The principal needs to prepare to be an optimist every day, right? The principal needs to be self-sufficient and have self-efficacy and needs to be resilient. So it makes you think about, okay, so is a leadership born or or you can prepare yourself to be one, these personal characteristics sometimes are not considered when we expect principals to be successful. So, interesting, when I prepare principals in Texas, they need to go through a master's degree, okay, in order to take an exam and be certified. And here you have the PQP preparing principals. So looking at the PQP and some of the courses in the master's program that look at the specialization, and coordinating a program for social justice, a master's program for social justice in Texas, a colleague of mine and I included these three things. There must be a combination of theory and practice for principals. So for you to be informed and to use data and know curriculum, you have to have a little bit of theory, right? But there must be time for reflection in looking at those theories before you turn that into knowledge that you can apply. Okay, so that reflection time, we allow that to happen in every course that we give. Also, there must be an opportunity for you to learn about self. If you don't know what your psychological, social state and your cognitive states put together mean to other people, you really can't control sometimes your emotions, okay? So one activity that I use in one of my courses in human relations is the zones of comfort. So you have the three circles there, and I can exemplify to you how we use reflection and how we put all the skills and knowledge together in this activity. So when I talk about zones of comfort, the comfort zone is that zone where you know what is being talked about. You know how to manage what's going on in the school. You feel at ease. You have no tension, okay? If you are in danger, in a danger zone, you retreat to a comfort level. And for example, if you have difficulties with two parents arguing in the school, you retreat to a comfort zone and you have a certain kind of response. Okay. The risk zone is the most fertile area for learning. Is where you're going to exercise some of the things that you don't feel so comfortable doing, but you know that you could learn something about the experience right there and then, and you can kind of develop some skills to deal with that situation. And then there's the zone of danger, things that are completely foreign to you. You don't know how to deal with them, and you don't even know what kind of response you're going to get once these things happen, right? So the exercise for neophyte principals and those that are training to become one is to know exactly what the danger zone is for you and to try to transfer those to the zones of risk where you can kind of play with that situation and you know what kind of reactions you need to have. So this kind of concludes our presentation when we talk a little bit about three different aspects of the principal research and principal experiences.
Thank you very much. Would anyone in the audience like to start off with a question or a comment? Patricia, you might get the microphone. Well, I might start just with one, and that is, Betty, in terms of the psychological resources that you talked about being important, how might people who are either aspiring to be principals or in existing leadership positions in schools, how might they approach that if they feel they're currently not resilient enough in the face of perhaps direct criticism from a colleague or an inability to understand how to deal with conflict? What do you suggest?
The interesting part of playing with emotions is that you really need to know yourself, and your histories. This is something that I really try to develop in my research. who you are transfer to your educators, transfer to your students and your parents. And who you are also come out in your leadership. So the more you have time to reflect on where you came from, how you grew up, the images that you have. I like to play with metaphors and with images, right? Like the book, Don't Think of an Elephant, and you think of an elephant immediately, right? All these pictures that you grew up with play in your leadership every day. So dedicating that time may help yourself in terms of how you are leading the school. Of course, feedback, and sometimes they're not very constructive, but what kind of zone are you gonna play that in receiving feedback from your teachers and your colleagues? It's a solitary position. So.
Okay, I'm going to continue and just ask a couple more questions. One more from you. You talked of knowledge and skills being important, but also from what you've said, values underpin a lot of what effective principals do. So can you talk about some values which might be helpful for people to keep in mind if they're not already employing those values in their work each day?
Yeah. Today I didn't dedicate much time talking about values because those are things that are listed in both the Texas expectations for principals and the Ontario Leadership Framework, like having a vision for the school, sharing that vision with your community, including parents, including teachers, everyone, all stakeholders in that conversation. So those values are pretty laid out. Interestingly, when I looked at the Ontario Leadership Framework, what I saw is that there is also a framework in which we include several things that are important for the development of schools. One of them is student voice, but I didn't find student voice in the school level leadership. Like principals should be like this, should take care of their teachers and work with them in curriculum. But I couldn't find anything about students. Maybe you guys can help me and explain how the standards translate into student voice.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Along that same line, I've heard some people say that because of the increased managerial aspects to the role of the principal, that it's not necessary perhaps that they be teachers. And that while cognitive knowledge of effective teaching practices is important, that those layers of self-efficacy and resilience and optimism are actually more important to the managerial role. What are your comments on that?
Good question. You want to start? Thank you. You could answer that one.
Just who's going to go first? I'll take one for the team. Well, of course, for the most part in Ontario, most administrators have come through the ranks of being a principal and vice principal in preparing. I think that there is value to having people understand what teachers are going through in their classrooms so that they can empathize and understand the situations. It also comes down to a bit of, street cred. If people can't talk the talk that others are walking in the hallway, then there can be a disconnect and a lack of valuing and respect for, I think, administrators who may not have been, on the front line. Now, in our research, we didn't ask people that specifically, and everybody that I interviewed had, for the most part, fairly long teaching career, vice principal career, and administrative career in schools. Now, some of them, there were a few that had left teaching and they had come back in, so they had other kinds of experiences outside in management and business and those kinds of things. But I don't know, Betty, if in your system you have principals that are not teachers.
Not in Texas.
No.
U.S. is really hard to generalize, right? Every state does things a little different, and the districts also adapt depending on state mandates. They adapt certain things, but no. You have to have a master's in education to become a principal, but you have to have a specialization in educational leadership. And to get the master's in educational leadership, you have to have at least 2 years of training as a teacher. So there's no way into getting into the leadership without being a teacher. And in small areas, some principals are also teaching, right? So how do you bridge that separation of being a leader and also a teacher? Sometimes when there's tension, like I see here, right? That I saw happening here. There's nothing like that in Texas. Actually, in Texas, we don't even have unions, teacher unions. They're illegal. And there's a clause in the state that they can fire at will anytime, even though there's growth plans and everything in place, processes for development of teachers. Principals can go in a blink, too. Something happens in the school, those things that they like to put in the media, and the principal is gone the next day. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about, like, to connect some of what I was saying to what I heard Betty say in your question. Because I noticed when I looked at the leadership framework, like, political skills and knowledge isn't named as a resource, and yet I think there's lots of researched evidence to show that it could be. Now, it could be that it haven't been directly linked to student achievement, which is why it doesn't appear there. That's sort of my friendly wondering. But I also sometimes wonder, to your point about the argument, I've heard it too, right? Like, we don't really need teachers in schools, we just need good managers. And then I wonder about that might argument. I wonder if there's a piece of that says we actually don't want policy actors making decisions and appropriated. We want technicians. I think that a lot of times people talk about that in terms also with some reforms, some curriculum reforms where there are some that are actually even scripted. So the idea being that maybe we don't want people taking on their political role or seating themselves as political actors with the agency to make changes. And so I'm not saying that's the entire argument for the administrator question about do you have to really be a teacher to be a good school principal, but I feel that there would be something lost, and I think in part of what is lost might be some of that understanding around working with policies that are competing from different groups and at different times, and thinking about how you might be able to bring them together. And sometimes I wonder if that might not be an intention at the same time.
There was another question from the audience somewhere. Okay, well, I'll ask another question. Sue, you talked about the inherently political nature of much of principals' work. Mm-hmm. How risky, picking up what Betty was saying, how risky is that in a climate when governments are increasingly cautious about principals becoming independent actors, as you've talked?
Well, I think it's not, I wouldn't use the word risky other than I would say that it's inevitable. So whether we name it or not, it's happening all day, every day, making decisions that are impacting students, teachers, families, communities, oneself. And so it's not a question of if we should act politically, but more that I'm arguing that principals do act politically, and I'm arguing for a greater explicitness of that and recognition of how that happens, because of course we know some people who sort of have this savvy and they can work, they can act politically to get all kinds of goals, some of which maybe we wouldn't really agree with or that we wouldn't necessarily support. And there are others who feel much less comfortable thinking of themselves as a political actor. But then those folks, the research shows that those folks are then therefore less likely to be able to achieve the goals that they do want to achieve, and many of them may be some of them may be around social justice or student achievement, ones we would actually like to see happening. So I don't think it's a question of like, should we act politically or not? I think that we do. I say to my students that even to say like, I'm not going to accept any responsibility, I'm not going to take any political responsibility. I said, well, that's a choice also. Like that in and of itself is a political choice, I would argue. So it's not whether we make a choice, it's which choice do we make, and then given that we have to make it, towards what purposes do we move. And I think that's where it kind of comes back to thinking about one's philosophy and purposes and goals. So I see it as inevitable, not a choice.
You know, I would go back to our previous conversation of being a teacher or being a principal, because as a teacher, the last thing you want to be is political. But if you had access to some people like Giroux or Michael Apple, that says, okay, if you're a teacher and you don't agree with that curriculum, but you don't do anything about it, you are being political about it, and you're deciding to go with what somebody established for the kids. So when you become a principal, the political aspect of it is okay, am I going to advocate for the kids, or am I just go with the flow with something that people have created and I'm just going to follow that status quo, right? So Alan Walker, a professor that, I think he's a British professor, right?
That's
that now
right.
lives in Hong Kong. He talks about what kind of principles are you preparing? Remember, I'm talking about preparation, right? Are you preparing clones that just look like you? Are you preparing drones that don't have initiatives? Or are you preparing dragons that fly in the air, spit fire, and will change things around, but have that braveness in them, right? So it's a big responsibility. You, as a teacher, may be being a political, and then all of a sudden having to step into taking charge of a school, having a vision, and enacting that vision. Which one of those principles are you going to be? Right?
Any questions?
I'd just like to say I'm enjoying the conversation, and just a couple of thoughts, and I'd be interested to hear other folks' ideas as well. But in terms of the instructional leader versus manager idea, I'm wondering how you would feel about this thought, that in the end, I think what becomes principals in some cases is that the longer they're out of the classroom, the more difficult it becomes to be an instructional leader, because you're forever more removed day by day from the initiatives that are ever flowing into a school system. And while you may be aware of them, to put them in practice and to see the pluses and minuses and the strategies involved, it's just not part and parcel of what you do on a regular basis. So to become an instructional leader as opposed to a manager is increasingly difficult the longer you're there. I'm wondering about the principal preparation thoughts that you've offered. And my question is this: how would you go about preparing folks to work in an environment where there will be controversy? I would submit to you that everything that takes place in the school in one form or another is political. Big P, small p, tiny p. But the thing is that you are going to have in a school system, whether it be Texas or Ontario, competing points of view that don't want solutions, right? They want what they want, right? And I'm interested to see just how people could be trained to address situations that have no resolution, right? There's different points of view, there's different clientele being represented, and sometimes there are solutions that are sought, and sometimes there are no solutions sought at all.
I'll start with the first about the instructional leadership piece. That's one of the pieces that I'm curious with the interviews that we've been doing. So far, we've only interviewed 6 secondary school principals. So I'm interested in seeing how they understand leadership based on secondary and elementary, because the literature does say that secondary principals will say that they're not really involved in instructional leadership because they leave that to their department heads. I'm also interested in looking at experienced and I won't say inexperienced, but principals new to the position. Because I think that there will be some differences there as well. In our study so far, we haven't had a lot of people who are new to the position who have, stepped up to the plate to be interviewed by us for a number of reasons. Probably they might not feel confident, probably the political climate, there's a lot going on. The few administrators that we have interviewed that are from elementary and are new to the position tend to be those that have only been in the position for 2 or 3 years. So they are also the ones that interpret in instructional leadership as the modeling of being in the classroom, whereas the more experienced administrators don't necessarily talk like that. So that's one of the things that we have to figure out in the data part to be able to answer that. But that's definitely something that we are curious about. Yeah. So thanks, Steve. Do either of you want to talk about the second?
That was a great question. We managed to include all our topics.
Okay, sure. So I'm just going to try to think, sort of like practically speaking, if I have a group of people in front of me, how might I work with them? So the first thing I would do is I would just name it, right, like you just did. Like I would argue that everything you encounter has got a political element to it. So rather than working from a document like the leadership framework that doesn't actually name it, I would argue a lot of what it demands of principals would require that they have a lot of political skills. But right off the bat, I would name it. I would work, in the classroom situation. I would talk about, I could use like case studies as an instructional strategy. I can invite in experienced leaders through the internships that principal candidates have, build in assignments. Hopefully it would come up naturally, but if it didn't, I would kind of like make it happen. I would talk about how there are some dilemmas that are unresolvable. So we've talked about purposes of education. We talked about that in our classes. Some cannot all be achieved at the same time. They just conflict. So coming to terms also, I think, with some of the unresolvables or the ongoing conflict. I think we live in a society that, we want answers, we want them now. We want to choose, we want to find the right thing. And so instead of looking about, pardon me?
We want everybody to get along.
Yeah, well, so instead of looking at like, okay, this is it, we're going to decide, but to instead say, okay, you know what, we're going to, there are some things that are going to be like a for now solution that's temporary, that's going to be revisited multiple times rather than like that's it and that's final. I would also point to cases where we have actually like witnessed how principals have negotiated some of these situations, sometimes just to give students ideas. When I talk to them, I think, I hadn't thought about that. So as an example, a friend of mine at the University of Buffalo, Jill Koyama, worked and looked in New York City schools. And just to try to make it as simple as possible, principals were mandated to pay outside organizations to tutor their students as part of No Child Left Behind. And some principals really did not think that public money should be spent on for-profit institutions for tutoring, or they didn't think that the money should be spent paying someone else. And so some of the things that they did, because on the one hand they had to comply with a federal policy and their Department of Education, but sometimes they would act creatively. So one thing that they would do with that, they might offer incentives, so increase student enrollment to those organizations that would agree to work with the community-based organizations in the school. So they would say so they would try to navigate it that way. They might they would ask for evidence to see that what was happening in the tutoring services was actually related to what was happening in the school, because actually that's not a requirement, which seems a little unusual, but it's not. So she would ask to see what actually is happening to make the connection, and then they would make choices that way. Sometimes what they would do is they would say to the providers, okay, but if you have to match what we're already doing, or you have to reflect what our staff looks like, what our students look like, our curriculum and our instruction. And if you don't, then I'm not going to renew your contract. So these were some of the kinds of strategies that the principals in this study used to work with a particular policy that they didn't necessarily, some people were okay with it, but some were not. And so depending on how they felt with it, they worked within the boundaries of the policy, but did so in ways that were help them to achieve their other kinds of goals. So in one case, to work with, make sure that the community still had access, to another, to make sure that the programs were aligned. And so, and then the researcher concludes that, that the principals were able to enact creative and practical management of the problems that were actually created by the policy itself, that were not necessarily intended, but it actually, while in some cases it shut down opportunities, and in other cases it opened it up. So I think that's sometimes just sort of throwing out those examples and real life cases, I find just gives people some ideas that they hadn't maybe thought about otherwise.
So how many of you here are principals? So each one of you probably has at least one story of human behavior problems, right? Can you talk to me a little bit about a political example? Because the question is not like, okay, how do we solve this problem? But they're so diverse, right? There's different situations in which you have to mediate or be political. Tell me a story.
Well, I have one, Betty, and it's from a nice, safe place called Australia. One of the principals whom I interviewed a long time ago, who was a high trust principal, a principal whom her staff, and there were about 55 that we interviewed, about 50 of them said they would walk over hot coals for her because she was trusted. The other three principals were trusted but not highly trusted. But the distinguishing feature that particular principal had that made her a high trust principal was her ability to deal with some of the things you talked about, her ability not to punish colleagues, teachers who critiqued what she was doing in her role as a principal. So that was a very important feature of her leadership, which enabled her to keep people moving in a very important direction. So what is the place of trust in relationship building? And then I'm going to ask Katina the same question.
Well, that goes a little bit different from the question that was posed by Steve. Can you ask that again? Because I had his question in mind.
Okay. What is the place of trust? For example, just to give you a sense, you talked about us knowing ourselves. Sometimes when we go into a situation with absolutely honourable motives, that may not be read by others. Mm-hmm. Some people are low trust in their outlook. Others are more willing to trust and take risks and have a leap of faith. So where's the place of trust and trust building for formal leaders such as principals?
That's a very complex question. If you think of how a principal is between the board demands and trying to meet the needs of teachers and students, while having all these requirements in terms of accountability and all these paperwork that you have to spend a lot of your time with, right? So it's a very difficult question. I think all principals are very authentic in their intent to build a great school. Many of the things that where trust is broken is not really in their control. It was never in the intent. But in the situations in which you encounter these positions, which school would you want to work in? The one where the kids are not ready to come to school, when they're not fed before they come, where there's socioeconomic challenges, where the kids see their relatives or families shot, or you want to work in a school where everybody's happy and ready to learn, right? So I guess it's really difficult to answer. Same with the question that you had about, okay, so how do principals do what they have to do with all these challenges in front of them? Well, the group that I was describing, the students that we have, we work on a lot of social justice issues. Social justice meaning you have to go circumvent certain requirements or certain protocols in order to meet the needs of students. We brought the group to a national conference, the University Council for Educational Administration. You were there, right? When they were talking about, okay, so you learned all these things about being for the students, and you're going to go, and now you're ready. You're done with your coursework. You're done with your exam. Now your principals, what are you going to do? Many of them says, I'm very scared. I'm very scared because I don't know if all that I've learned and all that I believe I'll be able to do.
They're honest comments. Can I just ask Katina, and then we'll hear from Sue. So Katina, based on the research that you've done and the comment you've made about the primacy of relationships, how do principals build and maintain good relationships, including trust?
I think in Cole's Notes version, I think one of the things is, first, in the climate that principals are working in now, they need to understand the multiple labor contracts that they have, for starters, because sometimes some of the issues that arise come from principals not knowing, and they may do things that, or may have done things, made the mistakes, not knowing their contract, and creating situations or a fire that they have to put out. That, I mean, and that's usually a baseline general one. But I think trust comes also with consistency. And, you know, people can trust that somebody's going to be inconsistent, right? And people can also trust that somebody's going to be consistent. They might not necessarily always respect the person's decision, but they can trust that they're going to be doing things in a particular way. So I think that's also something we need to be clear about with trust. I think relationships, we need to see individuals as human beings first. And we have to understand that people come to the profession with different understandings of education and their role in it. So, and principals need to be astute and in their staff that they have for how they're going to build relationships on an individual basis, and that may be starting out with just a small number of people. I mean, there's all sorts of metaphors talk about, like, you know, seeing what grows in your garden, you know, what kind of plants they're going to be, and weeds and all those kinds of things, and how you're going to deal with each of them. So there's something about consistency, it's something about building relationships, and it's something about the human component to it. And I think right now in the interviews that we do, we ask people about, you know, leadership is about relationships. And we, you know, in some of the latest interviews, it's been, so how do you think you're going to continue building those relationships after everything that's gone on, right? And they talk about things like being honest, being consistent, trying to be fair. And I think sometimes it's also preparing people that there are times when decisions are not going to be, it's not going to be unanimous, and it's going to be a decision that's going to be made by the administrator. But that can also be done in a way that people will respect the administrator for doing that.
Right. Sue.
I was going to say 2 points. They're not from the same source, but they both related to trust. So on Katina's point around consistency, also I think the idea of authenticity, again, so it's possible that when you're faced with a situation that you don't agree with, so I'll just, as an example, maybe a testing as an example, and you may say, you know, I want to work towards equity, and yet you're in a position where you have to administer tests that you know have produced inequitable results. So then there's a researcher in New York, Gary Anderson, who says there's a difference between going ahead and doing the tests anyways and saying, you know what, I don't really like these tests. Like, if you don't have to endorse it, and you can still do it, but you don't have to endorse it. And if you have a good you have relationships with your staff as well as your community, I think to say, you know what, this is one of those things what we're going to keep pushing back. And by the way, I can't really do this as principal as well as you might be able to as a member of such and such community group or as a group of parents. You have a different kind of voice and a different kind of opportunity here that I don't have, or it's different. So this isn't something we cannot do, but I don't think this is something we should do without making some noise about it. So how can we then use our various resources to make that position heard. So I think it comes back to Katina's point about being honest, and I think about being authentic. And it also reminded me when you talk a lot, we want parents involved. Well, when I was a teacher, I didn't always want parents involved. It kind of depended on the decision. It kind of depended on what I was trying to make. So, but I think that that's the kind of thing that can erode trust, right? When we keep saying we want this, we want that, and then we don't do it. So I think it's sort of being, this is one where, we need some parent, this is a situation, just being as honest as you can be and calling in sort of the resources, the human resources, the people around you that you developed relationships with. And I also wanted to say that the fourth reason, that top 5 reasons principals are dismissed, is because they fail to establish trust. So from another more direct point of view, it's pretty important from a job point of view.
Great, thank you. Some other questions from the audience?
Actually, I have a couple. So I wanted to start off with you, and I wanted to ask where the research that you're talking about when you're talking about the reasons why principals are fired.
Oh, yeah.
Are you referring to the Ontario context or?
This was in California, this particular study that I have right in front of me.
Okay, yeah. Because in looking at the blue pages, it seems to me that principals are mostly dismissed for maybe financial reasons, other personal reasons, as opposed to the reasons that you're mentioning.
Okay.
Okay, so the main question I wanted to ask is, I am at a stage where I'm a bit unsettled, where principal's work is concerned. Coming from the Caribbean, having been a classroom teacher for 11 years, researching principal's work for my undergrad, for my master's, and being a researcher with Katina's team. From the interviews that I've had personally with principals, from the transcripts I've read, and from my own research, it seems to me that what is missing from the Ontario Leadership Framework, what is missing speaks volume as opposed to what is in there. And it seems as so that I want to ask Betty about your preparation programs as well. Because it seems to me that we're preparing principals for administration. But when you ask them about the daily challenges, the challenges revolve around interactions with teachers and so on. Yes, the workload is a hassle for them. They say that. But I would say that maybe 75% of their work has to do with building relations with staff. And if we look at the actual leadership framework, we'll see that the PLRs, the personal leadership resources, are listed right at the bottom, almost as an afterthought. So I would argue that, and I'm wondering, Betty, if those are included in your leadership programs. They're not in your overall framework, but I'm wondering if an emphasis on developing the personal, the cognitive, the psychological, the social aspects, which are so critical in the interviews that I'm doing with principals, and that's why I'm looking forward to hearing the principals themselves validate the comments that I'm making, because that's what we're getting from the interview, because that this is where the challenges lie, with the interpersonal relationship, with the social, the psychological. But it seems in our framework that these were included almost as an afterthought. So I'm just curious to hear from the principals themselves, if what I'm saying reflects their work, and I'm curious to know if in your program, Betty, if there's this emphasis on developing those other attributes for principals.
Okay, maybe I can start with the program. Yes, the program that we have is designed so that we can talk about reflecting on these issues of how to deal with people, how to deal with things that we don't necessarily agree in education, how to be profound in understanding where it's coming from. Remember, the difficulty in that area is that the curriculum is crafted for them, right? San Antonio, for example, is in the Bible Belt. So it's difficult for you to go against the community if they're the ones enforcing some of the things that are in the books. Also, how do you advocate when there's like the anti-immigration policies in Arizona, for example, where things are being erased from the books and you have no control over it, and you will have to agree to erase that knowledge from the schools going into the kids, and knowing that that's part of the kids' history. If Mexico was once Arizona was once Mexico, kind of thing. So we talk about these things in our program, in our courses, in knowing the community. One of the activities we do as well, besides the zones of comfort, is every student in the community relationship course will have to run a community meeting. And a community meeting is not for you to call them to school and tell them what the high stakes testing is going to be about. It's about you going into a family house and call all the neighbors in and have some sort of discussions around the children's education on how to create grassroots movement that will help your work as a principal in the school. How do you create those ties? So it's difficult work, and you can already foresee that for us to have the principal of the school agree to prepare this teacher to go out and have a community meeting is very difficult. But in some occasions, the principal is thrilled and adopts the initiative every year, because the connection that you make with that family that has a lot of influence in other parents is a precious tool for you to become a better trusting principal in that campus. So those are some of the things that we do in that program.
I was just going to say that Katina and I want to say I agree with you, Donna, about that a lot of things being left out of the leadership framework being as important of what's in there. But I always, just as a reminder, it reminds me that the leadership framework is itself a political document, of course. And so Katina and I published a paper, actually, this is what I'm talking about today, is kind of the front end of that paper, where we actually looked at the PQP guidelines and said, okay, knowing that they're built on the Ontario Leadership Framework, if a school of principal preparation, university, a provider wanted to teach political skills explicitly in policy appropriation within the framework of the PQP, could it actually be done? And I feel that we demonstrated, darn it, that absolutely, because the guidelines themselves have to be implemented, interpreted, appropriated, that we actually point out ways that, well, if you wanted to read it this way, this could be read as an endorsement for teaching this particular political skill. If you wanted to be able to influence for people for vision, you could recognize that influence might involve motivation, and therefore that opens up the discussion for how can you teach about how to motivate, what motivates different people. So I would agree that there's what's left out is important, but I would always I try to encourage people I work with, again, look for the opportunities within the document. Don't feel limited by what's there, because another way to look at it is, well, if it's not there, it doesn't mean it's not allowed, like it's not excluded. Maybe someone just forgot.
Some more questions?
It's not a question, it's an observation. When I've been listening to you in terms of talking about those roles that principals have to take on, and the tensions and the zone of comfort, et cetera, I can't help but think a principal you need to talk to is a principal who's gone through a school closure. Because every one of those elements is involved in that process. That tension between being the leader of the school, having relationships with staff, being a representative of the board. Every one of those elements is involved in that process. And as I said, it's simply an observation that it might be interesting for your research to talk to principals who have gone through that particular process.
Yes, definitely.
Thanks, Mom.
Thank you. There was actually a PhD student that recently graduated, just did his dissertation on school closures in Ontario. So
It's been done.
I read through about half of it, so I can give you a quick synopsis later. But but it's very, very interesting. And my question was going to be for all of you, and building off that same point, I feel like a lot of what everyone's been talking about today is looking at those tensions that principals have, feeling that they're kind of in the middle between the parents, the students, the teachers, the administrators, their communities, and all that. And so, continue to talk about their managerial roles versus their instructional leaders, their political roles versus their maybe pedagogical roles. And so I'm just wondering how you feel about these trends, maybe where you see it going, and then possible solutions to that as well, and whether that would be, throwing infinite resources at school principals, as we all wish we could, or anything else. I mean, for example, the way I'm thinking is, Katina, from working on the project, a lot of what I've heard is that I was amazed at how some of the principals discuss sort of feeling, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but alienation or isolation in their roles, especially elementary school principals who don't even have a VP. And so looking at sort of these tensions that they're trying to reconcile, and where or what kind of resources could or should they be getting, to alleviate them. So that's for everybody.
That's for everybody. Okay, I went first last time. No, okay. So, Michael, you want to know what resources we can use to support administrators that feel isolated and alienated?
And just that feeling how that maybe if they do feel that they're stuck in the middle, I mean, where should they go, or what should they get, or
what I'd like to say is that we currently have a collaborative master's program here with one of the local school boards, and one of the goals of that collaborative master's program was to encourage administrators that are currently in the position or aspiring administrators to build networks, informal networks that can be supports for administrators, because administrators might not necessarily want to call their boss about an issue, because it might be the issue might be with their boss, right? So there are ways that there can be supports, I think, built within the system. I know that there are formal mentoring opportunities, but there's also informal mentoring that has occurred and can occur. And I know that this program was meant to create sort of lateral networking for people moving forward. I think that principals have the opportunity to be a part of associations in Ontario, which is not necessarily the case in other jurisdictions. And I think that those associations can provide support for administrators as well. I think the connection between closing the gap between research theory and its use is also important in supporting administrators, because it's not just neophytes that might need support. I mean, things are changing quite fast. I mean, I remember going to a conference where there were UK researchers, and they were saying, well, we're talking about this policy, but by the time we get home, it probably will have changed again. And I mean, we all laughed, but in some senses, it was kind of true. Things would change halfway through the school year sometimes in the UK when I was teaching there. But I also think it's important to hear what administrators have to say, and I know that there are a number of administrators in this room. Do any of you want to respond to what Michael said? Because I know that also is connected to well-being and mental health as well, because it's a very demanding job, in many ways time-consuming. Yes?
Well, I know for me when I started, my connection with many of my colleagues came out of first a formal. First, I had a formal mentoring through our school board, and then that grew into a real friendship. And then her friends became my friends, and it was really nice that we all support each other. So I think there was a lot of value in having the formalized mentoring program, and then it went from there.
Does anybody else want to comment? And I mean, that's that tension around the last tension I had, right? Collaboration. But it's also collaboration in the profession too, right? You know, you can't have superintendents saying, and I'm not saying that this happens, but you can't have situations where superintendents say, please come and, you know, bear everything to me, and I will support you, and then I won't judge you, and in some cases it does. I mean, years ago you would hear private companies that would have these retreats, and they would do all sorts of crazy things, and it was all supposed to be about bonding. Well, there were actually studies that followed these, some of these companies after, and in some situations people will go home and get fired, because they were supposed to be, the retreats were supposed to be around trust, and people were going to be honest and authentic with each other, and it really didn't end up being that way. What happened was, in a year's time, some people were let go and gone. And so they realized that these kind of retreats, and we're all going to come to some kind of greater understanding and collaboration, and what's going to happen around a retreat and moving on wasn't necessarily happening. So there has to be time given to those kinds of relationships and trust building. And it's also around the thing too about voices and being heard. I'd like to call it, there's consultation and then there's insultation. And you know, and I call it insultation when we bring groups of people together to say, these are what our concerns are for our profession and our work. And people listen, but nothing is changed. So you can't invite consultation if you're not going to act upon what you hear. And if you don't have the means, the time, the effort, the energy, or the interest to act on those things, then there shouldn't be consultation, because it's then insultation. And then what happens is people won't bother to participate anymore, nor will they trust. And I think that's the important thing. And that comes to also, and this is kind of off topic, but it comes with like including parents, right? Come tell us what your issues are, and we won't do anything about it. Well, you know, that's insultation. Don't waste people's time, in a sense.
I just wanted to comment that I do find I have a few colleagues who are friends who I rely on a great deal in my role. And then there's the other side where you mentioned the association that we are privileged to belong to in Ontario. So we have the Catholic Principals Council of Ontario, and then we have our local Principal and Vice Principal Association with the board. It's interesting, it's very difficult to get members of our association together. And there are many reasons for that, many factors. Time is, it doesn't matter when you hold the meeting, you know, you can't get people together. And I see, in my perspective, from my perspective, that there are people who are unwilling to share their experiences because they don't want to be seen as incompetent or vulnerable, or that, you know, why would they do it like that? Like, I never would have done it like that. Whereas I think if we did get together and talk, we would see that we're all making very similar choices and can support each other. So I don't know if your research addresses that at all, but it is of interest to me that we are isolated. You've all spoken about that, and yet it's very difficult to get us together.
It's interesting you should say that, because there are lots of strong themes within the interviews. I mean, you could bring administrators together, and there are a lot of them singing from the same hymn sheet. I would also say that there have been efforts made to do virtual, online, virtual, safe places for administrators to participate. I know that there was a project, it's currently on the go right now, out of University of Ottawa, and one of the researchers there has partnered up with a couple of boards there to try to bring principals together in a safe virtual realm, so it's password protected, so particular people come in and talk that were invited to come, as a place for them to informally mentor, but not do it face-to-face because people are busy. Of course, the challenge, though, is that they are so busy that it's even difficult for them to get online. So, you know, that's the challenge, right? The demands of the job. Yeah.
You had a question or a comment?
Just a comment about. One of the things that I do is I take advantage of opportunities to network. I belong to a provincial association committee We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and there's a lot of talk that happens about what we're supposed to be talking about, but there's a lot of talk about what we're doing in our own roles in our own schools, and these folks are from all over Ontario. Other things that I'm involved in that are ministry driven that affect the school I'm at, I meet with a bunch of principals and a lot of people I've worked with before in another school board, and so we connect that way and get together. I'm at the stage of my career where I'm a mentor and not being I guess protege or whatever you want to call, and I'm doing a cross board mentorship right now with a new principal, and the opportunities there are wonderful. It's a learning from both sides. So these opportunities you have to take advantage of in our roles, and the formalization is not necessarily it has to be there, but it's taking opportunities of all those informal methods of networking and connecting with people from all over that really seem to have had a lot of meaning in my career.
So what is one thing that you would say to someone starting today? What do they need to know that's most important or first?
What was that?
Are you sure?
How much time?
The advice I would give people is to get involved in things that go beyond the walls of the school, because that's where your networking opportunities are going to happen, and you're going to make some friendships with folks that you may not have had the opportunity to make friendships with, and build the relationships that are necessary to network and converse and to improve what you do.
Thank you. That's kind of what you said as well.
Patricia's hand in the back.
I don't know if they're comment worthy or not, but we've been talking a lot about the notions of trust, and I guess at one point when you were talking about it, I said trusted by whom? Which to me kind of points to the complexities of what we do. You know, you could be trusted by the kids and not trusted by the faculty in the same school. And so that was one observation that I had made. It's there are very, people's criteria for trust throughout what we do is a sliding scale. The second thing that I would like to comment on was this notion of isolationism. I have a kind of peculiar assignment this year in that I have an office in an elementary school. I'm a high school principal awaiting the opening of a new school. And so in past experiences on the local principals, vice principal group, that I had sort of been exposed to that notion of the isolationism of the elementary administrator because of the lack of a VP in most cases. And I guess what I was wondering was, is there any research been done on that notion of, if not actual isolationism, that I think to some degree we do sort of impose a certain isolationism on ourselves, and I'm not sure whether that's valid or not. It was an observation, and whether there are other people in similar administrative roles in other walks of life, do they experience the same sort of isolationism, or are they more open to networking?
I don't know anything of any research right offhand around isolation and principles necessarily. There may be, I just haven't had a chance to search for any of that yet. We do know in the private sector to do any kind of research around CEOs of, say, Fortune 50 or 500, it's next to impossible to do any research with them or around them or on them because they're just not available. So if you want to talk about isolation in a sense, now they might not be isolated in the ways that we talk about isolation, but they certainly are not accessible. So I mean that gives you, what do we mean by isolation too, right? So that's what came to mind for me. And I'm not sure, I don't know, there are other researchers in the room. I don't know, Jim, if you've heard of any research in that area. Patricia? No. But that would be interesting to look at. There's not necessarily a lot of research either around VPs, by the way. It seems to be that they are an anomaly. We just We expect that we put people in the VP position, they'll learn what to do, and then somehow it prepares them some magical way to be an administrator. So I mean, there's some kind of like mixing pot, just throw them in, you know, it just goes. So that's another area that needs some attention in the research for sure. Yeah.
Great. We've just got a couple of minutes before we finish. Are there any comments from any of the panel members that you would like to share? Any final thoughts?
I would like to thank you all for coming and for sharing some of your thoughts with us. Sometimes we stand here in the front trying to find out exactly what is going on, right? And I know you asked questions about, okay, so what do we have to do? And I guess we're going to be doing this for a while in our careers because we don't have direct answers for a lot of things. Did you have another comment?
Well, I'd just like to thank you for doing the research.
Yeah.
I think this is an area that requires considerable study. And how we encourage people to move into administration from the ranks of teachers and developing that and looking at the work we do. I think it's tremendously valuable, and I thank you for doing it.
It's very meaningful to me, the work of principals, especially because, like I said, we all have our own histories, and the high school principal I had really made a difference in my life. So I do this always thinking of him. But I guess it's our career. We are dedicated to it.
I'd like to say that there's going to be a lot more stuff coming out of our research. We're hoping to get 60 or 70 principals to participate in our study. So if you know of anybody, you can't see my email address there, but find me on the Western website. We'll be publishing from this for quite a while, and it's a passion of mine and ours. We are starting new programs here at Western, and we wanted to make sure that our programs aligned with what principals need in the field. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I just want to thank you. Lots of great possible research topics, not just for us, but perhaps any of you in the audience. We're always looking for great people to work with, those who are keen and bring a personal passion and history to it. So, yeah, thanks very much.
And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight on a fairly cool evening. Would you join me in thanking our fine discussants, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading more of their research as it's published in the coming years. Thanks so much.